Returning to training after being sick. How should a hiker go about this? This is a situation that so many hikers get into in their preparations for adventures because, in all honesty, we all get sick at one stage or another. And in that normal situation, it can be frustrating enough. But if we are leading up to a specific trip, if we are intentionally on a plan to try to improve our fitness and our strength and our performance for our hiking adventures, this can be really, really annoying. So today I just want to talk through a few ideas around how to go about this to kind of make this process go as smoothly as possible. Now, this particular video was inspired by a question I got in the group from basically saying, this is the first week I've gotten back to exercise after being sick for about 2 weeks. I get a little bit more than halfway through my normal routine and I'm exhausted. I don't feel like I'm starting over, but I lost strength during the flu. Is there any tips on recovering my strength? And this is sort of a situation that I help with hikers pretty much every single week. Loads of my clients go through this, and it can be pretty straightforward. Now, the problem when it comes into this situation is obviously returning to training after being sick and returning to hiking after being sick can be pretty tough. More than likely, if we've been sick for 2 weeks or more than likely we probably have lost a little bit of strength and a little bit of fitness. Realistically, some of the adaptations in our body, which helps with our aerobic fitness, which helps with our strength, has probably begun to decline a little bit. 2 weeks is definitely not enough time for us to completely lose our fitness or our strength or anything like that, but there probably has been a little bit of a decline. Now, on top of that, and sometimes this is a little bit more apparent, is our body and our mind can just sometimes take a little bit of time getting used to things. So even if you haven't technically lost any strength or fitness, or even beyond that, just purely for the fact if you've been sick, getting back into things feel tough. It's just the way it goes. And this can happen even if we've only been sick for like 2 or 3 or 4 days. We know even that can feel really hard. But that's way too short a time for us to have actually lost anything technically. So there is that sort of in there. Now, the biggest problem I see from hikers and pretty much anyone in general in this situation is they're training along, everything's going well. They get sick, they have a period off, and then once they're feeling kind of through the other end of things and they're kind of feeling back to normal, the biggest issue I see is people just getting back into their normal routines. And the issue is here, there can be a little bit of delay when we kind of feel back to normal for our everyday living and our everyday activities and actually being back to normal for our training and our exercise. And sometimes there is a little bit of a delay. So essentially, if we just jump right back into what we were doing, even if we kind of feel like we're more or less back to normal, this can often set us up for failure. Because the issue is, these sessions, as an example, will feel really, really hard. Your body's still recovering. Your body's still getting back into things. Things will feel tough. You will probably feel not so great in the moment. You may start feeling a little bit out of breath. You may feel a little bit nauseous, depending on what type of sickness you had or whatever it may be. And also on top of that, afterwards, it can be a little bit tricky. Because we go through that session, we get into that situation, we're like, oh my gosh, that sucked, I had to stop, it felt really bad. And then we start getting in our head, we start beating ourselves up. We're like, oh my gosh, we're useless. Oh my gosh, I've lost all my fitness. Oh my gosh, and this and that. And that is bad in itself. But if that continues on, I've seen so many people kind of hit this sort of barrier and completely fall out of the routine. And they try to get back into their training after being sick, but then it doesn't go well. And they're like, oh my gosh, I'm just not going to get back into things. And it completely throws them off. And I've seen time and time and time again, people fall into this situation. And we don't want to do this. And then finally, if you are just overdoing things, if you jump right back into where you were and you have been sick and you're not respecting the recovery process, this can obviously put us at a risk of getting sick again. Because when we are training hard and when we are doing difficult sessions, whether this is difficult in a normal situation or whether this is difficult when we're in our recovery and everything just feels harder, this can affect our immune system temporarily. But if we're still in the recovery process, this can actually end up sometimes getting us sick again. Not something that we want. So the solution to this, what should you be doing if you've been sick? Instead of just jumping back into things, my best piece of advice is please, please, please be nice to yourself here. It is perfectly normal for there to be a week or 2 delay for you to get back to your normal level of training before you after you've been feeling more or less back to normal. And it is perfectly fine for you to ease yourself back into the training and adjust things. And in actual fact, I really strongly encourage you and essentially change the difficulty of the sessions so you can ease back in so it can feel comfortable, so you can get the body moving again and then get to that point where you're like, I've gotten through this and then now I can get back to my normal routine. So this is typically what I recommend. We're going to use the example of having 2 weeks off of training here. And essentially a simple way of going about this, the first week after being sick, whether you've been sick for a week or 2 or even 3 weeks or whatever it may be, in the first week after being sick, if you're kind of getting back into things, don't go back to what you were doing previously, but instead look at what you were doing previously. Try to get the same sessions in if you can, but you want to reduce things down. And a simple rule of thumb is just reducing everything down by about 50% in the first week back. So what that means is if you're doing strength training, you could look at your normal workouts and you could say, you know what, I'm either going to reduce the repetitions I do in each exercise by about 50%, or I'm going to do like half the weight. So for example, if you were doing 15 squats and you're like, hey, I could do this pretty comfortably, then when you're easing back in, just do 7. It may feel enough. It may feel easy. Either way is absolutely fine, but essentially we want to get through this, get the body moving and win and set up what we call a success loop where you get back into things, it goes well, and then you can bump up. The same thing with cardio. If you're doing pack walking, or if you're doing stair and hill climbing, or if you're doing some type of intervals or whatever it may be, just reduce things down. You can either reduce the time by 50%. So if you're doing a 60-minute pack walk, just do 30 minutes on the way back. Or if you're doing 20 minutes of hill climbing, just do 10 minutes. Or just reduce the speed and pull things back pretty significantly than what you're doing before. Or if you're doing training hikes, then reduce the time in the pack weight or the pack weight by about 50%. So if you were doing like a 6-hour hike before with 5-kilo pack or a 10-kilo pack, then just do a 3-hour hike with a slightly lighter pack. That works out pretty well. So just be nice to yourself in the first week back. And the intention here, just getting the body moving, getting back into your routine and setting up that success loop. And then at the end of the week, you can make a decision. If you get to the end of that week, you've done that easy session, and you're like, you know what, that went great. That was pretty good. I'm actually feeling really good. I've kind of got that energy back. I'm like motivated to go again. Then essentially the next week after, just go back to your normal training, see how that goes. Perfectly fine. Alternatively, you might come to the end of that week and you might be like, oh, I'm still not really feeling 100%. Even though those sessions were reduced, they still felt pretty bad. And it was still a bit of a struggle. Then you may want to do another reduced week. But essentially the next week, you do everything about 75% of what you usually do. So you're still not quite back to your exact what you were before, but you just ease yourself in. And again, this is just bumping things up a little bit, gently introducing it can be really, really useful. So that's the typical solution that I would recommend for most hikers. Now, the only other sort of consideration, or the main extra consideration here, is one time you may need to just put a bit more thought into this, and it may just need to be adjusted a little bit more, is if you're on a specific timeline for a hiking trip, and say you've got a particular trip coming up in 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 10 weeks, and you've gotten sick, and then you realize, oh my gosh, I'm in a bit of a rush to get ready. I'm kind of behind where I need to be because of this sickness or whatever it may be. So for example, if you've got like 6 weeks, if you had like 6 weeks until your trip, and you were like, oh my gosh, I actually had to hike every single week because I needed to build up my distance. I need to build my pack weight. And all of a sudden I got sick. I'm like, oh, how do I do this now? Or if you're just aware that like, look, I'm way behind where I need to be, and that sickness made me even further behind. Well, in these situations, we may need to get a little bit more creative, because obviously we want to respect the recovery process. But on the flip side of things, we also just want to make sure that, okay, you're getting yourself to the position you need for the trip, because the next worst thing could be is just being completely underprepared for your trip and risk that being an absolute nightmare, not getting through it, or just not having a good time. So you basically just need to ask yourself, in this particular situation, if you are still in a bit of a rush and you're like, oh my gosh, I haven't got that many weeks ahead, I kind of need to get into things, you need to ask yourself, how can I expose myself to the things that I actually need for this trip while still respecting my recovery? So it's not a case of just throwing yourself back in the deep end and just going 0 to 100, but you're thinking about, okay, what do I actually need? What are the main things I need to hit for this trip? And how can I respect my recovery? So you can get a bit creative here. There's lots of different ways of going about it, but here are a few sort of situations just to give you an example that I've used in the past. For example, I've sort of come to been with a person who's like, okay, I had a trip coming up, I got sick, and now all of a sudden I'm way behind on what I actually needed to do to hit my pack weight. I was already in a rush to try to build up my pack before the trip, and now I'm behind. So in this situation, what we may look at is, okay, during the recovery period, we may just look at lots and lots and lots of short, easy pack walks each day. So this may just be 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, even 30 minutes of slow, casual pack walking, and we can still build up the weight, but they're very, very short, they're very, very gentle, so that's still respecting the recovery process. And then once we're out of that, then we can ramp things up properly. Or if we were sort of behind on hiking time and distance, and we were like, you know what, actually we have to ramp up the distances, we're kind of a little bit behind on that now, then it may be a case of saying, okay, I'm out of my sickness. I'm ready to get back into things. Maybe I'm going to still plan to hit the targets that I was aiming for. Maybe I was originally planning to hit a 6-hour hike. I'm still going to try and do that. But to respect my recovery, I'm going to make sure I'm on a really, really easy trail. Like this is just flat, it's just gentle, it's the easiest thing I can find. And then on top of that, I'm going to intentionally rest a little bit more than usual. And I'm going to have not just a lunch, not just a morning tea, not just an afternoon tea, but I'm going to have 3 or 4 long breaks. So it may end up being, okay, I'm actually doing 6 hours of hiking, but I was actually on the trail for 8 hours or 8.5 hours, and all of that time was resting. So again, you can kind of balance it out there. And then on top of that is if you are doing this, just make sure you're nailing your hydration and nutrition. So that's another way of going about it. Or if you're just behind on everything and you're like, oh my gosh, I need to ramp up my pack weight. Oh my gosh, I need to ramp up my hiking. I'm freaking out. This can obviously be a little bit tricky. One approach that I have used in the past is, we just get back into the normal plan and we sort of say, look, we originally planned to do a 5 to 6 hour hike this week with a 10 kilo pack. We're still going to do that even though we're in recovery process. But what we're going to do is we're going to load up your pack and make sure when your pack is loaded with those 10 kilos, it's all made up in water bottles. And then every hour, I'm going to dump a kilo or I'm going to dump 2 kilos or whatever it may be. So you start off with that full pack weight. You do that for a little while and then you make it a little bit easier, a little bit easier, a little bit easier as you go through. So again, this can be a way where you can manage it. And some people may only do the first hour with that full pack weight and then dump all the water except for the drinking water and go from there. That can still be a decent way of going about it. So you can be flexible there. And again, in that situation, we'd have way more rest than usual. So I would sort of say that type of stuff, you only really want to do that is if you are on a really tight timeline and if you are kind of freaking out about that. But for the majority of the situations, if you're just generally training or you have a lot of time ahead of you, give yourself that week to ease in, see how you go, and then if you need another week, go right ahead. But realistically, everyone will run into this at one stage or another during their training journey. You basically just want to respect the recovery process, be nice to yourself, don't beat yourself up, and you will get back to where you need to be. So I hope that makes sense. Anyone has any questions of that, please just let me know.